Rimworld is a game I loved on my first playthrough. After that, I got heavily into mods and had a few more playthroughs heavily modded, which were great fun. Recently, I decided to come back to Rimworld. Since it had been a long time, I decided to play a mostly vanilla save. I was planning to do a You Should Play video about it, but on replaying, I found my opinions were a lot more mixed than I remembered. I still think it's a great game, but I don't think I can recommend it without some caveats, so let's jump in with a review. Rimworld is a colony management game where you control a colony of people called pawns. It brands itself as a story generator, but I'm not sure that's a great description, as it doesn't really explain what the gameplay is. I'm also not sure that the stories generated are all that interesting, but that's more of a subjective thing. It's more of a sim strategy game focused on base building and survival. I'll start with the gameplay and then talk about the presentation a bit later. The game has a wide set of systems for things like mood, temperature, food, medicine, and much more. There's a lot being simulated here, but most of these systems are quite shallow once you get to know them. I feel the game tries to do a bit too much and struggles from being unfocused with many half-baked systems. To help focus this review, I'm going to start talking about the game in relation to the flow the game has, from starting a new game up through finishing the late game. When starting a new game, you're asked to pick a starting scenario, a storyteller, and the area you want to start in. After that, you're given a list of colonists which you can re-randomize and rename. The most impactful choices here are the storyteller and the scenario. The storyteller changes what conditions cause random events to occur, varying from mostly random or a fixed set of rules. For first-time players, the classic storyteller is probably the way to go, but playing on anything other than the random storyteller can lead to the game being repetitive. The scenario you pick mostly differs between if you choose new arrivals or a tribe. New arrivals start with electricity unlocked, but less people. Tribes have more people, but a longer early game due to starting without electricity. I find the early game to be the most interesting part, so tribal starts are my favourite. There are more choices when starting a game if you're playing with mods or expansions, more on both of those later. As you generate your pawns, you'll get your first glimpse of one of the main systems in the game. Each pawn has a set of traits that affect how they behave as well as what they can and can't do. They also have a set of stats for each skill. Some stats will have 1 or 2 levels of passion, which makes the stat grow faster. This is basically all that diversifies your colonists in the vanilla game, although with mods they can become much more interesting. In addition to all this, pawns also have a mood bar. The mood bar can be increased and decreased by certain situations. If it drops too low, the pawn will suffer a mental break. These mental breaks vary, some of them are dangerous, but the main effect of most of them is having the pawn be out of action for a while. They might embark on a sad wander or become reclusive, during which time you can't control them. Once you start the game proper, you're thrown into a mostly empty map and left to build your base. The base building has a lot of freedom to get creative and is one of the funnest parts of the game in my opinion. The vanilla game does lack proper tools to plan out your colony ahead of time though, which can be a little bit painful if you're doing a run with no mods. As well as being able to build your own buildings, you can also grow crops, mine ores, and do several other things to affect your environment. There are ways to optimize things, but the game is forgiving enough that you can get away with whatever design you want and not be at too much of a disadvantage. I'm a big fan of the creativity that comes with base building. Now let's talk about the early game. The early game is my favourite part of Rimworld. You're given a map, some supplies, some pawns, and no real goal except to keep everyone alive. Before you have a long-term food supply, defences, housing, and everything else set up, you really feel like you're fighting to survive. A lot of time is spent both figuratively and literally fighting fires. Since you don't have access to most of your technologies yet, during the early game you're really at the mercy of your environment. And because of that, the early game tends to be the most diverse and varied part of the game. In addition, not having many colonists or supplies means that events can be a lot more meaningful than later in the game, so let's talk about those now. There are a few types of random events in Rimworld, but 2 of the most important are raids and quests. Quests are given to you by other factions and vary quite a lot. This is one of the main ways you'll interact with factions, as the diplomacy system is basically non-existent without mods. Often, people will ask to stay at your colony temporarily. This will give you more manpower, but at the cost of an extra mouth to feed. You'll also often hear about nearby camps with items of value to raid. Some of the quests are more interesting, like people wanting to test weather machines in your area and paying you for the privilege, but these more interesting quests aren't very common. Most of these quests are entirely optional, and you can choose to ignore them if you wish. Now let's talk about the raids. During raids, enemies appear on the map and make their way to your base, attacking anyone on the way. Because of the limb-based injury and medicine system, a small injury can lead to your pawns bleeding to death or getting a deadly infection. If your doctors and medicine aren't good enough, these can be severe. This means that raids can be either deadly or negligible depending on how the injuries turn out. That said, losing pawns is a normal part of Rimworld and isn't game losing at all. In fact, despite the game's reputation, if you're willing to carry on and build back up, on most difficulties Rimworld isn't really that hard. You're only going to straight up lose the game if a raid comes at the worst possible time. Even then, there are numerous events that get triggered if your colony is at breaking point to try and save it. When you're low on colonists, the game is more likely to trigger events which give you more of them, so losing colonists isn't even that big a blow. Eventually though, your colony will either die out or you'll get the required research and components to stabilise and reach the mid-game. Once you get a long-term supply of food, good defences, and enough colonists to handle all your tasks, and you're pretty decently stocked up overall, the colony becomes stable. From this point on, you don't really need to do anything to keep the colony up and running, and you're no longer in a battle for survival. Raids coming at a bad time and other situations can still make things tense, but overall, there's less for you to do here. This leads to my biggest issue of Rimworld. No matter how you start, once you get to the mid-game, every colony plays near enough the same. There's no more push or urgency. You're well equipped to recover from any situation that happens, and your time is more spent figuring out what to do rather than helping out your colony to survive. Raid size is based on your colony's total wealth, which means there's no pressure to keep progressing. Things don't get harder until you progress. It's here where the lack of depth in the system starts to show. With mods there's a lot to do, but in vanilla everything is so simple to manage that you just don't need to think too deeply about anything. This part of the game lasts a really long time and can get repetitive, especially after the first playthrough. It's a shame because this is easily the most boring part of the game for me. Most of the interesting stuff happens either in the early game or the late game. It's also the easiest part of the game, so there's a U-shaped difficulty curve here. Eventually though, you will get big enough and advanced enough that the difficulty will begin to spike and you'll enter the late game. The late game happens when you're beginning to use the advanced technologies and trying to get to one of the win conditions. In vanilla, this involves building or finding a ship, but the expansions add more. Most of them require the same things though. Get lots of resources and fight off lots of enemies. As you move towards these objectives, your colony wealth is going to increase dramatically, which causes raids to be massive. At this point, every raid can lead to multiple deaths due to just the sheer number of enemies. There are a few variant types of raids, but mostly they just run towards your base in big numbers. Due to the number of enemies and their relatively simple AI, the best way to design defences against this is usually to build some kind of cheesy setup to exploit the AI. You can try to use turrets, mortars and other defences, but you're punished for doing this. Since these defences increase your wealth, you'll get bigger raids, which offsets any help they would add. This part of the game is hectic and fun though, as the game is constantly throwing everything at you. It does draw a bit too much attention to the combat system, which is another half-baked system that isn't really that deep and without mods isn't very interesting. This is unfortunately a common theme with vanilla Rimworld. There's a lot of systems and a lot of them feel half-baked and not quite deep enough to be interesting. After you do achieve your victory condition, or you get overwhelmed along the way, the save is over. Now let's talk about replayability. Mods and expansions help replayability a lot. I'll get to those later though. In the vanilla game, I found that starting new colonies in harsher environments or in novel scenarios was fun, and I got a lot of playtime out of those. The best runs and scenarios are the ones which create a difficult early game, because as I mentioned, if you do manage to stabilise and reach mid-game, you'll realise that no matter the start, the task of managing a stable colony is much the same. You can make your own fun to an extent by limiting yourself, but most runs get a bit samey once you hit the mid-game. Because of this, the vanilla game can be quite repetitive and really needs mods to spice it up. So let's talk about mods now. As I mentioned, the vanilla experience is full of these systems which don't have the depth to be interesting across multiple playthroughs. In addition to that, the game doesn't have too much variety in its random events. Finally, the game is a bit clunky and mods help with that as well. There are mods to fix all of these problems. There are mods like Vanilla Expanded which add a ridiculous amount of content and fix up a lot of the core systems in the game. There's also a lot of total conversion and quality of life mods. With mods you can fix most of the issues with the core systems and customize the game as you wish. For example, in the vanilla game you can start a second colony, but managing both at once is a pain. With mods like Colony Manager, it becomes a lot more of a viable playstyle. If you're a fan of games with vibrant modding scenes, I can't recommend Rimworld enough. This game has so many mods, and so many of them are of great quality. However, if you like to keep your games vanilla, you're going to find Rimworld has a lot of flaws. I'm not convinced the dev team are taking things in the right direction either, so let's talk about the official expansions, and I'll tell you what I mean. So since the launch of Rimworld, 2 official expansions have been launched. Royalty adds an Empire faction to the game, which you interact with and give your pawns noble ranks. As your pawns gain these ranks, they gain special abilities and benefits, but they also become more snobbish and demanding and hard to keep happy. It is a fun system and you're able to choose how much you want to interact with it in your playthrough, so it doesn't take over the game. It also adds psionic magic called Psycasts, which is a cool idea, but most of them aren't that useful in practice. The other expansion, Ideology, adds religions to the game. These religions add festivals as well as beliefs which change how your colonists react to certain things. They do a good job of allowing you to make more eccentric colonies like cannibals or raiders. However, with most of your colonies, the religion is going to become another system that isn't that interesting after you've figured it out. Each religion is generated at the start of the game and doesn't change throughout the playthrough. Sometimes it is fun to try and have multiple pawns from different religions together, but you're kind of punished for doing this, so I wouldn't really recommend it. There's also some ancient relics to find, although the quest chains for these are long and unrewarding and the relics don't really do that much when you get them. Both expansions are fine, but not spectacular. They feel more like official mods than anything else. I do think Ideology is the better of the two, since it encourages more varied playthroughs, but at £15 or your regional equivalent each, they are priced a little bit steep for my tastes. These expansions are concerning to me, as they indicate that the dev team is more interested in adding extra systems to the game, rather than polishing the ones that are already there. The game could be one of the best games ever if it was more polished, but the official expansions haven't really done that. They've just added more superfluous systems, and they haven't really changed the core game much. I do hope they're working on big general updates in the background, as well as these expansions. As for if you should get the expansions, I can't really recommend them unless you're already a big fan of Rimworld and want to support the developer. They don't add much once the novelty wears off. There's been a lot of negativity in this section, but I do want to say again, I do like the game. Rimworld is great, it just has so much potential if it does become more fleshed out. Now I'll briefly talk about the presentation before coming to my final conclusion. Rimworld's presentation is totally utilitarian, and is not the reason why anyone loves the game. The graphics are mostly lifted from a game called Prison Architect. I guess they do have some charm, but I do find them a bit simplistic. I'm not a fan of them, and I don't think they look that great. The music is fine. It's guitar music that sets a bit of a frontier mood while not being too obnoxious. It serves its job of being background music. I wouldn't listen to the soundtrack outside the game, but the music isn't grating either. The UI takes a bit of getting used to and is a bit clunky, but once you work out where everything is, it's fine. There are mods that improve the UI quite a bit and allow for a lot of customization anyway. As I said already, the presentation is fine, but it's nothing special. It's not the reason to play the game, but it's also not bad enough that it should put you off. My overall conclusion should be pretty clear by now. The game is good, but it's full of these shallow systems that once you figure out don't really have that much depth to keep them interesting. It is a good colony sim and it has the potential to eventually become one of the greats, but it needs to get its focus down in the right areas. Maybe in a couple years time it will be more polished and it will become one of my favourite games. As for whether or not you should play it, that depends. If you like colony sims and like this kind of game, you should definitely get it, you'll love it. Also, if you like games with a healthy modding scene and love mods, that's another reason to get this game. This game has one of the best modding scenes I've seen. Otherwise, I'd say the game is worth playing if you like the look of it, but it's not without its flaws. It's a good game, and I'll probably come back to it at some point, but there are too many flaws to ignore, so for that reason, only get it if you're willing to look past those. It rarely goes on sale, so expect to pay full price. If you like this video, make sure to subscribe and leave a like, leave a comment with your opinion on Rimworld, and I will see you all next time.